And I do believe, and I still believe now, that we did it in a controlled manner, and that I was able to control the ascent accordingly. But, as you say, the experts who have looked at it would say otherwise.
Gradually, he perceives through the clouds of his mind that what he has to do is get off the rebreather and on to open circuit, normal scuba, which he's carrying for the emergency. However, the carbon dioxide is still in his bloodstream and still clouding his thought processes. So he stays there and stays there. And his team around him don't understand what's going on, and they are watching him. What's happening now is that he's breathing very quickly. He's using up a very limited supply of gas, and he's going to use it up very quickly. As he ascends, in the end, you see that he runs out of gas.
As the CO2 enters Kevin's blood supply, his level of consciousness keeps falling, as does the supply of emergency gas. CO2 poisoning forces divers into a bizarre cycle of pointless repetitious action. It's called automaton behavior. Kevin may look as though he's in control, but actually he has already become detached from reality.
No matter how hard he breathes on compressed air at depth, he is not going to reduce the CO2 in his bloodstream to a level where he's back to normal in a very short period of time. The high level of CO2 is causing him to breathe rapidly throughout the dive. He's getting through his gas very, very quickly. The dive team at the moment are standing off and watching him conduct a slow ascent, which is admirable for decompression purposes. But sooner or later, if you watch the video, it's inevitable because of his breathing rate. He's going to run out of gas, which inevitably you see him, it happens.
At this point, we now have a semi-unconscious diver underwater with nothing to breathe. The safety diver offers his own emergency gas supply, but for some reason Kevin feels he doesn't receive any air from it. Another possible indication of his falling level of consciousness. As he desperately grapples for air, fear is starting to take hold.
I was breathing incredibly fast now, and it felt that the majority of air wasn't actually getting into my lungs anyway. At that point, there was probably a little bit of panic. Having been to the safety diver and taken his regulator and not what I felt got anything from it, I then went to your spare auto air, which then I took air from, and thankfully I got air from it. But there was probably, and what looks like on the video, a mild degree of panic of me grappling around trying to get some air from someone. But remembering I am still underwater, I'm breathing at an incredibly fast rate, and air is pretty important to me at that particular time.
At this stage the team are close to the surface, but then suddenly Kevin's level of consciousness falls dramatically. Watch his white fins on the right of the screen. At this point you can see that his legs have all but stopped moving. If he hadn't have been almost at the surface, it is highly probable that he would not have survived.
He could have died on that dive, and it could have been his last. If it had not been for the team around him, he would have drowned. He would have either drowned on the bottom, breathing that tank until there was no gas left in it, or he would have died on the ascent because he didn't make it to the surface on the gas he was carrying.
On the surface, but without any gas left in his 3-litre bailout cylinder, there is no way of inflating Kevin's buoyancy compensation device. Fortunately though, a police diver grabs him, and he is able to pull him out of the water alive.
If we look at the incident itself, some of the failures that were involved in it, the manufacturers produce very, very good guidelines that come with all rebreathers. And one of the first key issues is failure to follow the manufacturer's guidelines. The second one that obviously contributed to this was the repacking of the rebreather canister, a partially reused canister. That means the reaction front had changed. So it was inevitable that the diver was going to become compromised with CO2 poisoning. It was just a matter of time. The third thing was really failure of the dive team to recognize the seriousness of the situation once the incident began to occur. It took them a long time to actually get a handle on that. and that could have had a disastrous outcome if they hadn't realized towards the end. The fourth thing they really need to think about, which all divers need to think about, is the suitability of their gas for bailout. This was a particularly long dive. It was a mission that involved filming, which was going to keep the divers in the water for a long period of time, could potentially have created a fairly large, substantial decompression obligation, and yet the dive was being done with a 3-litre pony as a bailout gas. Was that suitable? Was the bailout gas for that dive appropriate? And people really need to think about that. There was a huge lack of rebreather diving experience, and I know that the team after this incident have spent considerable hours on the rebreather, and would all now admit at the time the incident occurred they had very, very little experience on diving rebreather technology, and had assumed that their scuba experience would carry on forward. It is a very, very different type of technology and requires a different set of skills, and I think they've now learned that as well.
You're playing with fire, you're playing with the breathing mixture that keeps you alive, and the CO2 absorbent, absorbing the expired CO2 from your breath, is a key element of the rebreather. It's a very, very simple thing to do. It's simply absorbed by the softener lime, the mixture of calcium hydroxide, sodium hydroxide. Another area that people have problems with is they believe that you have to pack the scrubber, and the problem there is that people overpack. Now what we're dealing with is a very, very simple filter that the gas has got to pass through in order to remove the CO2. So what we want to do is just fill the scrubber up to a certain level. It's self-packing. It's got springs on the plate, on the pressure plate. So it's self-packing. All you have to do is literally just fill it to the right level and put the lid on.
Kevin has fully recovered from the incident and is now back at work with the dive team. He would say that he always puts safety first, but now he has even more respect for the closed-circuit rebreather on which his life depends.